first segment for Stateline a few weeks ago, we embarked on our own short tour of the earliest history of Australia's national capital. Stage one, if you like, in the 1890s, when a multitude of proud towns and cities across the country aired their claims to being, as one turn-of-the-century writer put it with affection, the treasure house of a nation's heart. This all-in stage lasted just on a decade until Federation in 1901, when Section 125 of the new Australian Constitution specified that the capital would be in New South Wales, though it had to be at least 100 miles from Sydney. One man destined to play an important, if now forgotten role in the hunt for the capital was long-time New South Wales politician Sir Joseph Carruthers. Now, it's a pretty safe bet that most Australians these days would not know anything about him. Well, one notable fact about Carruthers is that he outlived virtually all his contemporary Federation founders.
So that on the 9th of May 1927, coinciding with the opening of the Provisional Parliament House, that elegant John Smith Murdoch building behind me, the Canberra Times brought out a special commemorative issue. This issue, in which the editor of the Canberra Times asked a politician to write the story of the birth of the capital. He would ask a state politician, Joseph Carruthers.
As forthright as ever, Carruthers, in an extensive article, meticulously recorded what he called the Battle of the Sites. Curiously, it is neither a jubilant nor even a particularly satisfying recollection for Carruthers. Quite the contrary. At one point in his opening paragraphs, he confesses, "It is none too pleasant to revive these memories of other days, and if there has been any change for the better in these last 20 years, one could afford to close the veil. But they have continued from 1901 right down to 1927 and will only now cease when the Federal Parliament finally meets at Canberra and the real seat of government is inaugurated there."
They have continued. They will not cease. Who's he talking about? Meddling, disrupting, undermining? Well, the answer to that question is one of Canberra's invisible yet revealing stories. The Battle of the Sites, Stage 2, that lasts from February 1902 to August 1904. And to be sure, it ends in a seat of government act, but not for Canberra. Now I'm getting ahead of myself.
After the euphoria of the new nation's celebrations in 1901, the Federation parliamentarians well knew that they had been entrusted by the nation with, as it was put at the time, expeditiously finding a permanent capital. To be in New South Wales, to the south most likely, inland certainly, and with plenty of water. And so began the search. The extraordinary tours of the senators and members of the House of Representatives. By train, by sea, by coach, and when the occasion demanded, with the active use of what my father used to call Shank's pony, legging out the distances if needed, walking and talking. Many a plug of tobacco was pressed into the pipes of our forebears as they sought the ideal city site. The first group to head out into the bush of New South Wales were the senators for 3 weeks in February 1902. The reps, even more adventurous, went at a breakneck pace over 2 weeks in May. Between them, they looked at sites in Armidale, Orange, Lyndhurst, near Orange, Bathurst, Goulburn, Yass, Tumut, Bombala, Albury, Lake George and Canberra via the Queanbeyan railway station. At one point heading south, they jumped on a ferry at Nowra to hasten the trip to the potential capital city port town of Eden Twofold Bay, where the town, and typical of the time, erected a federal capital arch to welcome the visiting parliamentarians. Eden put its best foot forward, but the delegation was on a mission and had to keep moving, soon embarking on the steep climb up Brown Mountain to the Snowy Region locations. It appears that no long coach climb was complete back then if you didn't have the leg stretch, and what looks decidedly like a compulsory group wee stop en route. This distinctive location looks well used. Keep your eyes peeled when you're next on Brown Mountain. About halfway down, you'll see a slightly sheared Battle of the Sites Federation rock. This rock, still very visible, neatly tucked in against the rainforest ferns. It's a subtly significant, if geographically distant, bit of Canberra's and Australia's cultural heritage. For the wonderful visual record of these site visits, we have the photographer Edward Thomas Monty Luke to thank, for he accompanied the parliamentarians and captured them on his elegant gelatin silver images, sometimes in formal mode and at other times full of mischief, spontaneity and, as historian Manning Clark put it, sheer buffoonery. The album containing Monty Luke's photographs, a real national treasure, is now safely housed in the pictorial section of the National Library of Australia. These first tours were orchestrated by the former New South Wales Premier and former anti-federationist Sir William Lyon, after whom the Canberra suburb of Lyneham was named. A big hulk of a man whom Billy Hughes, our controversial 7th Prime Minister, would describe as one of the most remarkable men in our history. Here is Sir William, deep in discussion with the first usher of the Black Rod in the Commonwealth Parliament, the debonair George Upward. Hughes would many years later recall Lyon's habit, when deep in discussion, of tweaking on his beard. And as you can see, Monty Luke caught the habit for us and for posterity. While New South Wales and federal politician Sir George Reid, our 4th Prime Minister, mentioned in my first Stateline segment, sardonically referred to these 1902 tours as Lyon's picnics, we know that the canny politician Lyon had a political agenda. He was the member for the massive southern New South Wales electorate of Hume, which stretched all the way from Wagga to the Victorian border, and he desperately wanted the capital in his electorate. Lyon lobbied hard for Albury or Tumut, but his federal neighbour, Austin Chapman, a robust Federation personality who's also given his name to a Canberra suburb and was the first member for the bellwether seat of Eden Monaro, Chapman, with equal determination, wanted the capital in his patch. So he promoted Bombala and the even more remote town of Dalgety. Since it always seemed likely that the Federation founders, firm believers in the restorative and revitalising qualities of a cold climate, would eventually opt for a southern location, for this Battle of the Sites it was game on. Lyon and Chapman engaged in their own battle for the ultimate prize. Nearly 3 years of intense parliamentary debates later, the Commonwealth Parliament produced a momentous and highly controversial decision. On the 15th of August 1904, the first Labor federal government, led by the charismatic Chris Watson, went for this place, Dalgety, before 1874 Buckley's Crossing, southwest of Cooma, and with a latitude somewhat similar to Thredbo to the west and Nimidabel to the east. Well, why? How did it happen? Who made it happen? And how in heaven's name did it finish up as a seat of government act of the Australian Parliament? The Dalgety story makes a rich contribution to the story of the Australian capital. This delightful little town rose to national prominence 3 times as the Battle of the Sites raged. In 1902, when it was closely scrutinised along with many possible locations. In 1904, when it had its moment in the Federal Sun with the Seat of Government Act, and then, having effectively disappeared in the years following 1904, it was back again at the business end of 1908 in ferocious competition with Yass Canberra. Clearly, Dalgety demands our attention. What we can say, with the benefit of 100 years of hindsight, is that Dalgety's plentiful water supply, inland location and cold, cold winters were for the town both the good news and bad news. The sheer abundance of water, so engaging to the eye in the then surging waters of the Snowy River running right through the town, powerfully influenced the two most significant surveyors at the time, renowned explorer, former West Australian Premier and federal politician Sir John Forrest, and Charles Scrivener, a New South Wales district surveyor, but a man destined to ultimately produce the telling survey of the Canberra site in 1909 and later to be appointed to the prestigious position of Director of Commonwealth Lands and Surveys. Forrest and Scrivener were adamant in 1904 that Dalgety was the best site for the nation's capital. Their reputation and status could not easily be ignored, not even by the New South Wales politicians determined to see the capital much closer to Sydney. But against the considered research of Forrest and Scrivener was the first-hand testimony of the federal parliamentarians who experienced Dalgety for themselves. Most found the site impossibly cold. As we would expect of any one of his descriptions of towns in rival Eden Monero, William Lyne dismissed Dalgety as an outlandish, freezing place where the climate, he said, would kill half of the older men. Queensland House of Representatives member Sinclair, used to balmy climes up north, was utterly intimidated by the stunted timber and howling winds. Winds so severe, he declared, that you had to hang on for dear life. On one excursion to Dalgety, a delegation of which Billy Hughes was a member, established the Order of the Blue-Legged Pelicans, a very weird society, Hughes would write, formed, as he put it, at a place where the highest flights of nature's beauty are associated with her lowest temperatures. When the Federation founders were engaged on these regular visits a century ago, there were two hotels in Dalgety, the Buckley's Crossing Hotel and Keating's Horse and Jockey Inn. The visitor today will find both buildings essentially intact. The Buckley's Crossing Hotel is still in business, while Keating's is now the home of local store owner Julie Pearson and her husband. Julie was kind enough to let the camera crew get this excellent footage of the heritage building today. It is heartening that the Pearsons are renovating the site, for it seems certain that the visiting parliamentarians stayed in Keating's as their lodging of choice. A few wonderful stories of those stays have survived. When the esteemed members of the Order of the Pelican were cosily ensconced in Keating's one typically brisk night, one of their number was almost the first fatality of the federal tours, having suddenly found his trousers alight because he was too close to the fireplace. However, dousing the flame evidently proved more problematic than it might otherwise have been, for the reason that the member in question had a wooden leg. They managed to put him out safely. On another night, with all the visitors imbibing and in garrulous mood, it was decided that a representative of the parliamentarians, the local state member Gus Miller, and a press representative, the leader of the Parliamentary Press Gallery, George Cockerell, would compete for what was described as supremacy in song.
We scorn the foreign yoke, for our ships were British oak.
Patriotic offerings such as The Death of Nelson and Let Me Like a Soldier Fall filled the air.
Like a soldier fell.
Hughes was the competition judge, and astute politician that he always was, he gave a popular decision to the local boy, Miller, by a nose.
Like a soldier fell.
The next morning, Hughes, ever the enthusiast, decides that everyone is going for a swim, and he gets up all his parliamentary colleagues. In Policies and Potentates, he takes up the story. In less than no time, we were all in the porch of the hotel, looking dubiously at the swirling waters of the Snowy River flowing swiftly down their channel, lit up by the golden rays of the morning sun. We had a close-up view of this historic stream, and at that distance there was no denying that it was picturesque.
But as we stood muffled up in our overcoats, not unlike the one I'm wearing today, the idea of swimming, says Hughes, became at every moment less and less inviting. Well, it was at that moment that one of their number, the local member, he was well used to it, Gus Miller, on the other side of the river, decides he would leap in. And Hughes takes up the story. We heard the voice of Gus and saw that remarkable man clambering like a bull seal on a half-submerged log near the opposite bank. "Come on, boys," called out Gus, "the water's beautiful." Well, he managed to encourage one of the parliamentary reps, a man that Hughes well knew called George Edwards. He watched Gus as he climbed onto the log and resolved our doubts by slipping out of his top coat and kicking off his shoes. "Come on," he said to us, "there can't be much wrong. Look at Gus." George, having reached the water's edge, stood for a moment irresolute and then, gaining courage as we gathered at his side, half slipped, half floundered in until he was completely submerged. Then, with an agonised howl, he clambered back on the bank. "My God," he said when he had recovered his breath, "it's liquid ice, I tell you, liquid ice." Hughes, recognising this, starts to be a little chagrined, but nevertheless, he decides that he will sit down on a log like this one, that he will take the shoe off and the socks, and he plunged into what he called also liquid ice. It was in 1908, it certainly is in 2008.
Most of our Federation-era forebears, Australian Britons to the core, revelled in winter weather. But it seems that with Dalgety, they were prepared to draw a line in the snow. Sir Joseph Carruthers, in his 1927 Canberra Times reminiscence, recalled a meeting with a number of Tasmanian and Victorian members of the Federal Parliament where he, Carruthers, mentioned Dalgety's inaccessibility. Whereupon one of the members said, "Yes, that is exactly why I voted for Dalgety." "What do you mean?" asked Carruthers, and the reply came, "Don't you realise that quite a lot of us deliberately voted for the most impossible site in order to destroy the possibility of having a bush capital inflicted on Australia?" Dalgety's dramatic rise to prominence in later 1904 only emphasised the indecent haste of its almost instant fall from grace. Twice. The New South Wales Premier of the day, one Sir Joseph Carruthers, and most of his colleagues in the New South Wales Legislative Assembly were having nothing to do with Dalgety. By default, Canberra's emergence had begun. And that's what we'll focus on next time. See you then.